Greetings and welcome to Chapter 3, Evolution, Biodiversity, and Population Ecology. This chapter will help students explain natural selection and cite evidence for this process, describe how evolution influences biodiversity, discuss reasons for species extinction and mass extinction events, list the levels of ecological organization, outline the characteristics of populations that help predict population growth, assess logistic growth, carrying capacity, limiting factors, and other fundamental concepts of population ecology, and lastly, identify efforts and challenges involved in the conservation of biodiversity. Today we'll begin with a central case study, saving Hawaii's native forest birds. Half of Hawaii's native bird species, 70 of 140, have gone extinct in recent times, and the percentage of species that teeter on the brink of extinction here today is higher than anywhere else in the world. The yaki is one of 30 species of endangered birds remaining on the Hawaiian Islands. It is a type of Hawaiian honeycreeper, a group of birds numbering 18 living species, and at least 38 species recently extinct, all of which originated from individuals of a single ancestral species that reached Hawaii several million years ago. Hawaii's honeycreepers thrived for several million years in the island's forests amid a unique community of plants. Today, native Hawaiian forests are under siege. Newly introduced organisms wreaked havoc because native Hawaiian organisms were unprepared to resist them. With the arrival of people, domestic animals, and invasive plants also came diseases. Today, few native forest birds exist anywhere on Hawaiian Islands below 4,500 feet in elevation. Conservation biologists and managers have worked hard to keep the forests protected. Young restored native forest is now regrowing on thousands of acres. More birds are using this restored forest year by year. Today, global climate change is throwing up a new challenge. Plenty of challenges remain, but the restoration successes in the Hawaiian forest so far provide hope that through responsible management we can save Hawaii's native flora and fauna and preserve the priceless bounty of millions of years of evolution on this extraordinary chain of islands. Evolution, the source of Earth's biodiversity. A species is a particular type of organism, or more precisely, a population or a group of populations whose members share characteristics and can freely breed with one another and produce fertile offspring. A population is a group of individuals of a particular species that live in a particular area. Evolution in the broad sense means change over time, and biological evolution consists of change in populations of organisms across generations. Natural selection is the process by which inherited characteristics that enhance survival and reproduction are passed on more frequently to future generations than those that do not, altering the genetic makeup of populations throughout time. Evolution has become one of the best supported and most illuminating concepts in all of science, and we must understand it to appreciate environmental science in any capacity. Natural selection shapes organisms and diversity. In 1858, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace each independently proposed the concept of natural selection as a mechanism for evolution and as a way to explain the great variety of living things. The idea of natural selection follows logically from a few straightforward premises that are readily apparent to anyone who observes the life around us. A. Organisms face a constant struggle to survive and reproduce. B. Organisms tend to produce more offspring than can survive. And C. Individuals of a species vary in their characteristics. Variation is due to differences in genes, the environments in which genes are expressed, and the interactions between genes and the environment. As a result of this variation, some individuals of a species will be better suited to their environment than others and will be better able to reproduce. From one generation to another through time, characteristics or traits that lead to better and better reproductive successes in a given environment will evolve in the population. This is termed adaptation, and a trait that promotes success is also called an adaptation or an adaptive trait. Accidental changes in DNA called mutations give rise to variation among individuals. Genetic variation is also generated as organisms mix their genetic material through recombination during sexual reproduction. Because evolutionary change generally requires a great deal of time, a species cannot always adapt to environmental conditions that change quickly. However, genetic variations can sometimes help a population against novel challenges. In this example, we see this original bird species with with an equal number of short and long beaks and a lot of beak lengths in the middle. And perhaps as it propagated and moved throughout various environments, in some environments those few with long beaks survived and thrived far more than the short, and this may have led to the long beaks being favored in certain environments, and in various other environments the short beak being favored. And this is a method of adaptation. Selective pressures from the environment influence adaptation. Closely related species living in different environments may evolve differently as a result of different selective pressures. Conversely, sometimes very unrelated species may acquire similar traits as they adapt to selective pressures from similar environments. This is called convergent evolution. Environments change over time, and traits that produce successes at one time or location may not be able to do so at another. In this example, we have the divergent evolution of honey creepers, an example we just talked about. In some environments, a short or longer beak may be favored and allow for divergent evolution of a single species. However, on the right, we have an example of convergent evolution, where two different cacti species that have never come in contact with another evolve in different locations, independent of one another. Evidence of natural selection is all around us. Scientists have demonstrated the rapid evolution of traits by selection in countless lab experiments, mostly with fast reproducing organisms such as bacteria, yeast, and fruit flies. Through selective breeding, we have been better able to augment particular traits that we prefer. This process of selection conducted on the human direction is termed artificial selection. Many of our domestic pets and food crops are a result of this process, and here we can see evidence of this process of artificial selection. An ancestral wolf was the predecessor to many of our domestic dogs, and as we bred the traits that we preferred in the wolves, we have come up with very many breeds. And on the right is an example of agricultural artificial selection, in which we controlled the evolution of this plant to give us cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, and Brussels and sprouts. Evolution generates biological diversity. So biological diversity, or biodiversity, refers to the variety of life across all levels of biological organization, including the diversity of species, genes, populations, and communities. Scientists have described about 1.8 million species, but estimate that maybe 100 million might exist. Speciation provides new types of organisms. So the process by which new species are generated is termed speciation. The main mode is generally thought to be allopatric speciation, whereby species form from populations that become physically separated over some geographic distance. When a mutation arises in the DNA of an organism in one of these newly isolated populations, it cannot spread to other populations. Populations can be separated in many ways. Populations can undergo long-term geographic isolation in various ways, as we see here. Maybe there's a volcano in it, and it somehow separates what might look like two islands from one another. Alternatively, sometimes new areas are created and organisms colonize them, establishing isolated populations. For speciation to occur, populations must remain isolated for a very long time, generally thousands of years. Evolution is not a fast process. So we can infer the history of life's diversification by comparing organisms. Evolutionary biologists study patterns, examining how groups of organisms arose and how they evolved the characteristics they show. Scientists represent the history of divergence by using branching tree-like diagrams called phylogenetic trees. And here we have one now. Once we have a phylogenetic tree, we can map traits onto the tree according to which organisms possess them, and we can thereby trace how the traits have evolved. Taxonomists use an organism's physical appearance and genetic makeup to determine its species. Related species are grouped together into genera, singular, a genus. Related genera are then grouped into families, and so on and so forth. Today, biologists use evolutionary information from phylogenetic trees to help classify organisms under the Linnaean systems rules. And here we see going all the way from the domain Eukarya to a single species under the Linnaean system. So it goes from domain, kingdom, phylum, and so forth, all the way down to a single species. The fossil record teaches us about life's long history. As organisms die, some are buried by sediment. Hard parts of their bodies, such as bones, shells, and teeth, may be preserved as sediments are composed into rock. Minerals replace the organic material, leaving behind a fossil. which is an imprint in stone of the dead organism. The cumulative body of fossils worldwide is known as the fossil record. The fossil record shows that life has existed on Earth for at least 3.5 billion years. Earlier type of organisms evolved into the later ones, and the number of species existing at any one time has generally increased through time. The species living today are a small fraction of those that ever lived. The vast majority are extinct. There have been several episodes of mass extinction or simultaneous loss of great numbers of species. Speciation and extinction together determine Earth's biodiversity. The disappearance of a species from Earth is called extinction. And here we have what looks like a man excavating the extinct species of dragons. Earth's extinction occurs naturally, for the most part, but human impact can profoundly affect the rate at which it occurs. It is theorized by certain people that a lot of the species that existed in North America when humans came on the scene, the extinction of these animals were led to by the humans hunting them. It's only a theory, though. It's really hard to prove anything like that. Some species are especially vulnerable to extinction. Small populations are vulnerable to extinction because fluctuations in their size could, by chance, bring the population size to zero. Species narrowly specialized to some particular resource or way of life are also vulnerable because environmental changes that make that resource or way of life unavailable can doom them. Species that are endemic to a region, meaning they occur nowhere else on the planet, also face elevated risk of extinction because all their members belong to a single, sometimes small, population. Island-dwelling species are frequently vulnerable. On a mainland, islands of habitat can host endemic species that are vulnerable to extinction. And here's a couple examples of that. In the U.S., many amphibians have very small range, so they're endemic to small islands of habitat that happen to occur on the mainland. For example, the Yosemite toad, the Houston toad, and Florida bog frog all live in these conditions. 40 salamander species are restricted to areas that might just be the size of a local county. And here's a very specific example. In Virginia, this salamander lives in a very small area and is endemic to this area despite being part of the mainland and not an island. Earth has had several episodes of mass extinction. These episodes, called mass extinction events, have occurred at widely spaced intervals in Earth's history and have wiped out 50 to 95% of our planet's species each time. The best known mass extinction occurred 65 million years ago and brought an end to the dinosaurs, which we're still really upset about. The sixth mass extinction is upon us. Many biologists conclude that human activities have caused an extinction rate that is 100 to 1,000 times greater than the historic background rate. So there's certain levels of ecological organization, and we're going to start with the definition of ecology here. And ecology is the scientific study of the distribution and abundance of organisms, the interactions among organisms, and the relationship between organisms and their environment. And ecology and evolution, they're tightly intertwined, and just going from the largest level to one of the smaller ones, the biosphere is the total of living things on Earth and the areas it inhabit. A community is interacting species that might live in the same area, and then an ecosystem is communities and the non-living material and forces they interact with. So you go past the biotic factors that include abiotic ones such as precipitation, wind, and things like that. And here's just a small diagram of what we're talking about here. Biosphere, ecosystem, community, population, down to an organism. So life exists in a hierarchy of levels, I was just saying, from atoms, molecules, and cells up through the biosphere, which is the cumulative total of living things on Earth and the areas they inhabit. At the level of the organism, ecology describes the relationships between the organisms and its physical environment. In contrast, population ecology examines the dynamics of population change and the factors that affect the distribution and abundance of members of a population. A community then consists of an assemblage of populations of interacting species. Community ecology focuses on patterns of species diversities and on interactions among the species, ranging from one-to-one interactions to complex interrelationships involving an entire community. And lastly, ecosystems, as I was saying, encompasses communities and the abiotic, non-living material and forces with which community members interact. Ecosystem ecology then reveals patterns such as the flow of energy and nutrients by studying living and non-living components of systems together in conjunction. So each organism will have its own habitat needs, and the specific environment in which an organism lives in will be called its habitat. Each organism thrives in certain habitats and not others, leading to non-random patterns of habitat use. Mobile organisms actively select habitats in which to live from among the range of options they encounter, a process which would be called habitat selection. So habitats are scale dependent. They vary with the body size and the needs of a species. So soil mite versus an elephant habitat will be vastly different, as you could probably assume. The criteria by which organisms favor some habitat over others can vary greatly depending on the species and their certain niche. And habitat use is important in environmental science because the availability and quality of habitat are crucial to an organism's well-being. Oh, so as I was just saying, I brought it up a little bit early, but niche and specialization are key concepts in ecology. So a species niche reflects its use of resources and its functional role in a community. Species with narrow breadth and thus very specific requirements are said to be specialists. Those with broad tolerances, however, are able to use a wide array of resources. These we are calling generalists. So specialists succeed over evolutionary time by being extremely good at the things they do, but they are vulnerable when conditions change and threaten the habitat or resource on which they have specialized. Generalists, on the other hand, succeed by being able to live in many different places and to withstand variable conditions, but they may not thrive in one situation as much as a specialist might. Population ecology. So population, individuals or particular species that inhabit a single area. And species have different arrangements of their populations, and we'll talk about that now. So population size is expressed as the number of individuals present at any given time and may increase, decrease, or undergo cyclical change or remain stable. And this is really just a number. So the passenger pigeon, as illustrated in this photo, there was once a very large population size, which no longer might be true. Population density, on the other hand, describes the number of individuals in a population per unit area. So rather than just a raw number of how many there are, we're looking at how many are there of this species in a square mile. And then population distribution describes the spatial arrangement of organisms in an area. There are several different population distributions. In a random distribution, individuals are located haphazardly in no particular distribution. A uniform distribution in which individuals are very evenly spaced, and then in a clump distribution, the pattern most common in nature, organisms arrange themselves according to the availability of resources that they need to survive. And here we have examples of that. Trees are a good example of random. Not exactly random, but it looks random. And then uniform, individuals spread evenly spaced. When penguins mate and they get ready to lay their eggs, they each take up a small space around themselves, and we can see that here. And then lastly, this one's very common in any species that stays together with its own species, is clumped. They concentrate in certain areas, and this is also dependent on the resources they need and the resources that might be available in their the location that they live. So a population sex ratio is its proportion of males to females, and this can influence whether the population will increase or decrease in size over time. 1-to-1 sex ratio maximizes population growth, as you might assume. However, most species are not monogamous, so ratios may vary and still lead to a very good population growth. Age distribution, or age structure, describes the relative numbers of organisms of each age within a population. And lastly, to show how the likelihood of survival varies with age, ecologists use graphs called survivorship curves. And here we can see the three types. Humans, we belong to type 1, where the highest chance for us to die is when we're young, and we have a high survivorship after that. And then frogs, drastically different. The survivorship of the young, the tadpoles, is actually very low. However, when they get to the toad form, they have a much higher chance of survival. And then the last one, type 2, is just a bird where it's a pretty straight line. It's pretty much any time they have the equal chance of dying. So populations may grow, shrink, or remain stable. Demographers, scientists who study human populations, use mathematical concepts to study population change. Population growth or decline is determined by 4 factors. and those four are birth, natality, deaths, mortality, immigration into an area, and emigration away from the area. Birth and immigration add individuals' population, where deaths and emigration remove individuals. A convenient way to express rates of birth and death is to measure the number of births and deaths per 1,000 individuals per year. These rates are termed the crude birth rate and the crude death rate. The rate of natural increase is determined by subtracting the crude death rate from the crude birth rate. And then the population growth rate equals the crude birth rate plus the immigration in minus the crude death rate minus the immigration away. So birth and immigration can be seen as adding to a population, and then the death and the immigration away can be seen as taking away from a population when we're looking at the growth of a population. So the rate of natural increase is determined by subtracting, I just talked about this slide, so I'm sorry about that. So unregulated populations increase by exponential growth. When a population increases by a fixed percentage each year, it is said to undergo exponential growth. A J-shaped curve shows this type of growth. Populations of organisms increase exponentially unless they meet constraints. So normally exponential growth occurs in nature only when the population is small, competition is minimal, and environmental conditions are ideal for the organism in question. Here's an example. So as long as this its population is kept in check with some sort of constraint, it may not grow very fast at all. But then once it starts growing and constraints are lifted, perhaps it's found a new environment and a new location to breed, the population will exponentially grow until it is once again constrained. So limiting factors restrain population growth. So what I was just talking about, every population is eventually contained by limiting factors, physical, chemical, and biological attributes of the environment that restrain physical growth. These limiting factors determine the carrying capacity, or the maximum population size of a species that a given environment can sustain. So the logistic growth curve is an S-shaped curve showing a population that increases sharply at first and then levels off as is affected by limiting factors. So this is what that bird exponential growth graph might look like when it experiences the limiting factors. It grows exponentially and then stabilizes at a certain rate. So the influence of some factors depend on population density. So that the influence of density-dependent factors waxes and wanes according to the population density. Density-independent factors are limiting factors whose influence is not affected by the population's density. And then also, just as a side note, the logistic curve is a pretty simplified model, and real populations in nature can behave differently, especially due to the cyclical nature of most population growth. And here's a couple examples. Yeast cells, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. In a lab setting, we can very easily get a very good clean S shape. However, the mite, which is in the top right here, we see that some environmental factor is fluctuating the population, but it also seems like it's leveling off at a higher population than it began. So crudely, this one still retains a bit of an S shape. And then down here in the bottom middle, the St. Paul reindeer, it actually does look like it achieved an S shape, and then some change in the environment has caused a decrease. And then what we might see going forward from here is another S-shaped growth, and then another decrease as the population experiences whatever might happen on a cyclical basis. Carrying capacities can change over time. Environments are complex and they're ever changing, and limiting factors on a population can also change, which will in turn alter the carrying capacity or how many can live there. And humans lower environmental resistance for ourselves. So this increases our carrying capacity, and a lot of our technology that we invent and think about, we have it aimed at overcoming these limiting factors so there can be more and more of us in any given location. In increasing carrying capacities for humans, we now use an immense proportion of the planet's resources. And what this does is, so the planet is finite. When we take the resources for ourselves and increase our carrying capacity, we're taking these resources from another species, and we're lowering the carrying capacities for these other organisms. So reproductive strategies also vary among species, and organisms differ in their biotic potential or capacity to produce offspring. Species that devote large amount of energies and resources to caring for a few offspring are said to be K-selected because their populations tend to stabilize over time at or near their carrying capacity. and we're a case species ourselves, and then species on the other side are selected, have high biotic potential, and devote their energy and resources to producing as many offspring as possible in a relatively short amount of time. Frogs are like this. Again, a frog example. It is important to note, however, that these are two extremes on a continuum, and that most species fall somewhere between the extremes of R selected and K selected. So, conserving biodiversity. Introduced species pose challenges for native populations and communities. And humans, we're developing this land and extracting all of our resources that we want, and we're growing as a population. This increases the rate of environmental change for other species too, not just us. Because we're also part of this community. We're not just a single species in an ecosystem. We're a species that's part of the community in an ecosystem. Science can help us understand how we're changing the environment, and impacts threatening biodiversity have complex roots, and we have to understand how these factors interact with each other to solve these problems. So introduced species, they thrive in new environments, eliminating native species, and native island species are particularly vulnerable, again, because they're isolated for millions of years, and they've never experienced pressure that these new species on their island are exerting on them. So evolved in isolation, they have very limited need for a defense against these pressures. And biologists and land managers, we often have to eradicate introduced species if we want to protect native habitats, and this is a very tough ordeal. And one example, again, in Hawaii are the pigs that we've introduced. They're being hunted, and pig-free areas are being fenced off, because pigs, they go feral rather quickly, and in an environment that they're not natural to, they can cause quite the ruckus. So we have innovative solutions, and they are working. Multiple people from different backgrounds, different firms, different sectors, they're all coming together, and they're attempting to protect the native species and habitats of Hawaii, for example. Invasives are being removed, natives are being protected, ranch land is now being converted back to forest. Coral communities are part of the largest federal protected marine reserve in the world, and this restored and protected land has resulted in ecotourism. It's the phenomenon that people, they want to see these natural lands and these species, and it brings in money for the island. So another challenge that we're going forward with here is climate change, and it's altering how we protect species and habitat, because land is typically protected to conserve the species that live there. However, with the climate change, the protected land may no longer even be suitable for these species. So we might have to think years ahead, where we have to find land that they might move to, and we might have to decide if that's suitable. And this really does just introduce a huge extra challenge that we might have to think about, what we will have to think about more in the future. So as we can see today, mountains are a huge example of this. So if you might not know, as you go up in elevation, temperature cools. So eventually, as the temperature keeps getting warmer and warmer, these species, they have to retreat north, and eventually they're just going to have nowhere to go. It's a mountain; they can't go down, and going up gets no cooler. So mountain species are particularly vulnerable, much in the same way island species are. And then this example is kind of a double whammy, because it's a mountain on an island. So just one of the many challenges that is going to face us in the future. So in conclusion, natural selection, speciation, and extinction, they all help determine Earth's biodiversity. And understanding how ecological processes function at the population level is very crucial to protecting biodiversity threatened by the mass extinction event that many biologists maintain is now underway due to humans. Population ecology also informs the study of human populations, another key endeavor in environmental science, because as we study the populations of animals, we have to realize that a lot of the pressures that are on their communities nowadays are being exerted from ours. So it's kind of a two-way street. It's not just one where the environment's there and it affects itself. We are a part of the environment, and we're exerting our pressure on the environment itself. So thank you for listening. This is going to be the end of Lecture 3.